All right, well, we are going to begin the review, and what you're going to need for this review is that packet that I've handed out to you in class. We're going to be going over the shaded or the highlighted areas, which are the specific questions that you have to know for the upcoming test. And we will go in order, so we will go chapter by chapter. The first chapter we're going to start off with is History of Psychology. Now this is chapter 14 in the Fast Track book, and this is about 2 to 4% of questions on the final exam. Now what that means is there's roughly a couple questions coming from this, specifically about 2. So in terms of the questions I'll be asking you is behaviorism you have to be well aware of on this exam, and this has kind of been a theme throughout the course. Behaviorism, remember, is the study of overt behavior. Okay, this was John B. Watson's belief. Remember, the B stands for behaviorism, that anything that's studied has to be observed. So basically it was the rejection of conscious experience. They were not concerned with the mental functioning as much as they were with what people do. Okay? Now, the other point from this chapter that you should be aware of is the emphasis of the evolutionary perspective. The key word you look for with this perspective is survival. Now, this is off the premise of Charles Darwin's natural selection. Nature is going to select organisms that are best suited for survival. Again, that's the key word, survival. Now, what is enhancing survival? What you look for is things that are often in aggressive behaviors that protect the person or protect the species. And basically, this can be a dog barking at a fence, protecting its area. Again, enhancing its survival. Also, reproduction. What species do to make sure reproduction is possible, that their species will, again, be able to survive. Now, the next chapter we're going to talk about is one of the chapters that's emphasized on the midterm as well as the national exam, and this is research methods. This will be 8 to 10%, okay, of the final exam, so there's going to be 8 to 10 questions coming from this chapter, chapter 1 of the Fast Track book. Now, we're going to start off with the role of descriptive studies. Descriptive studies, basically their aim is to describe. Now, case studies are an example of this. Now, by definition, case studies are an in-depth interview of a single individual or a rare phenomenon. Now, the problem with case studies is that they're atypical. In other words, you cannot generalize them to, the population as a whole. So case studies are often gathering a lot of information about a single issue, which is good, but the problem is usually it stops there where you cannot spread it off to other people where they can relate to it. Now, surveys, again, a descriptive study. Basically, surveys gather large amounts of information very quickly. You could give a survey to the entire senior class and get the information back within 10 minutes. The problem with surveys is the false consensus effect. The person who's writing the survey has the belief that everyone's going to agree with their point of view, and often what this affects is the wording of how questions are going to be. They're wording basically the questions the way they think people should answer because that's how they would answer. Also, the problem with surveys is the social desirability effect. People will often answer in ways that make them look very good. Now, in terms of designing and running, types of research methods, it always starts off with selecting participants. Okay, random sample or random sampling gives everybody an equal chance of being selected, okay, to be chosen for an experiment. So the main word in that is equal chance. In other words, everybody sitting in the room, whether it's 100 people, have an equal chance of being chosen through some type of random sampling process. Now, in terms of the next term, which is number 5 on this list, random selection or random assignment. What this is it gives everybody an equal chance to be assigned, that's the key word, to be assigned to either the experimental group or the control group. Now, this simply eliminates biases, where a researcher would simply say, I want these people in this group because he believes they're going to prove or disprove his theory or hypothesis. Now, remember with the experimental versus the control group. The experimental group is getting the independent variable, okay, whereas the control group is being held for comparison. In other words, to show the effects even more of the group that had the independent variable. In other words, in comparison to the control group who was not exposed, their percentage of scores was only this. Now, in terms of random sampling, what this allows is a representative sample. Representative sample is everybody has an equal chance, okay, of being chosen. But what it means by random selection is that they've been selected from a population. So in other words, if it is simply, okay, a representative sample, they represent the population of interest. And what that means is, for example, if you are simply having a study on high school students, then simply if it's a representative sample, everybody in that sample should be high school students. Now, number 6 on this list, correlational studies, there's always going to be a few questions. First of all, you have to know a correlational study does not establish cause and effect relationships. It basically establishes relationships, or it hints at possible, predictions of relationships. Now, in terms of a positive versus negative correlation, a positive correlation is that the relationship moves in the same direction. As one goes up, the other goes up. So the more you study, the better your grades. That's a positive correlation. A negative correlation, they move in opposite directions. One goes up, one goes down. Okay, but again, they're moving in opposite directions. So the more alcohol you drink, the less you can remember. Now, the strength of the relationship is always expressed through a correlational coefficient. This is simply the closer the number is to 1.0 or negative 1.0, the stronger the relationship. Okay? Now, remember, do not get confused by this, okay, by the negative sign or the positive sign. Okay? So if it's 0.98 versus negative 0.94, 0.98 is closer, okay, than 0.94, so it's a stronger relationship. Now, remember, illusory correlation is the belief there's a relationship, but in actuality there is not, okay? This is often superstitious type of behavior. People believe if they wear green socks that they're going to hit the golf ball a lot better. Now, they believe there's a relationship there, but in actuality it cannot be proven, okay? Now, moving on to the next page, okay, number 7 deals with experimental terminology. This starts off with independent versus dependent variables. Remember, in an experiment, this establishes cause and effect relationship. In other words, how one factor causes or has an effect on another factor. Now, this describes the independent and dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable of change. The variable of interest is how I taught it to you. So the IN for interest stands for the IN for independent. This is the variable that's being manipulated. Now, what do I mean by that? Manipulation means change. If you're running an experiment, you are introducing a change to a person and then measuring it. So in other words, if you simply say that someone's going to drink orange juice and that's going to change how much they can remember, what you're interested in is their consumption of orange juice because they've never done it before. In other words, you're manipulating them. You're getting them to do something they've never done before. Now, the dependent variable, I always say it to you this way, it depends on how you measure it. This is the variable that measures, okay, the effects of the independent variable. So if you went to an hypothesis, the if-then statement, and again, when you say the if word, whatever follows if is your independent variable. If a person drinks orange juice, then, now whatever follows the word then, the person's test scores are going to improve. The test scores in that particular example is the dependent variable. If I said it this way to you, in other words, your test scores depend on if you drank orange juice or not, okay? Because I am hypothesizing that you simply, if you drink orange juice, it will change the way you score on a test. Now, looking at placebo group, remember, that's the group that gets, so to speak, a fake independent variable, a sugar pill, just to guard against whether a person is acting or really being affected by the orange juice or the independent variable. Hindsight bias is the belief you knew it all along. You saw the outcome, but you basically didn't report it until after the results are in. This is your typical person watching football who says after the game, I knew Denver was going to win. Okay? Now it's hindsight because they're saying it after the fact. Now this is a bias because basically if they had this belief, they maybe have been setting up their experiment the whole time to prove their belief. Now, remember operational definitions, number 11. Operational definitions define how the experiment is going to operate. That's how you remember it. Now, what I mean by that, the importance of having these directions specifically written out is that if somebody picked up my experiment 10 years from now, they would be able to do the same experiment the same exact way, to either validate my experiment, prove it right, or disprove my experiment and say things have changed over the last 10 years. Now, remember research guidelines. Basically, you cannot deceive participants. You cannot cause harm to them. You have to give them informed consent and let them know exactly what they're going to be a part of. It also has to be voluntary. If you're using it as a part of a class assignment, there has to be some other type of assignment if they choose not to participate. And most importantly, a lot of times, you have to debrief that subject and let them know exactly what was done or why they did certain things in that experiment. The bottom line is you have to have ethical guidelines to ensure the safety of the participants. Okay, that was chapter 1. Chapter 2, biological psychology, is again a big chapter, 8 to 10%. Now, these are going to be really a lot of times straightforward definitions. Okay, so when you see these questions on the midterm, it's going to be simply defining them. For example, myelin sheath on number 1. Okay, you have to know that this insulates the axon. But what does it do? It speeds up the neural impulse down the axon. Okay, and that's key. You're going to see a question on that. Now, if the myelin sheath starts to disintegrate, what happens is you have the results of multiple sclerosis. Now, on page 4, continuing with biological psychology, neurocommunication, you have to understand what a resting state is. When a neuron's at a resting state, that means the inside, that's a key word here, guys, the inside of the cell is -70. However, when a message excites the neuron, lands on the dendrites, the receiving part, what happens to the inside of that cell, it starts to become more positive. This is called depolarization. It's deciding to fire an action potential. Now, what is an action potential? It's an electrical impulse that pushes the message down the axon. That's what allows neurons to communicate. So again, just to reiterate, because this could be a tough question, every neuron sits or rests at a -70 inside charge. When a message lands on the dendrites, it depolarizes it, making the inside more positive, allowing an action potential to occur, allowing the message to go down the axon. Now, for number 4, you have to know the difference between an agonist and an antagonist. An agonist is a drug that mimics or is the same thing as a neurotransmitter. So Motrins are the same thing as endorphins, okay? Stimulants are agonists for dopamine. Dopamine, again, being pleasure. Endorphins were being, natural painkillers. Now, in this particular example, you have to know the connection between acetylcholine and Alzheimer's. When acetylcholine starts to degenerate, you are left sometimes with the result of Alzheimer's disease. Now, an antagonist, remember, blocks a neurotransmitter. What basically that means is it prevents a neurotransmitter from doing its job. So if somebody has too much of a neurotransmitter, an anti-anxiety, anti-psychotic medication blocks the effects of that neurotransmitter because the person has too much. Now, for number 5, you have to know what a reflex is. The main thing with a reflex is reflexes are necessary for survival. So in other words, the brain doesn't have time to interpret the information to make a decision. So reflexes occur within the spinal cord. So you touch a hot stove, before you even know what happened, your hand is moved back reflexively, okay? Because the information only goes into, the spinal cord and then shoots back out through the motor neuron, causing you to move your hand. Now, for number 6, in terms of the nervous systems, remember the central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. Your other main nervous system is called your peripheral nervous system, all right? And we're on page 5, by the way. Peripheral nervous system connects the body to the central nervous system. In other words, it connects the body to your brain and spinal cord. Now, the peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary movements, and the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary, which means automatic things like your heart rate. Now remember, the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic. It's a branch of it. It speeds everything up, okay? Heart rate, respiration, okay? Basically increases, your muscle size, blood flow to the muscle. But remember, one thing that occurs in the sympathetic is your digestive system slows down, because everyone looks for the word increase. Parasympathetic calms you back down to homeostasis, returns you back to a resting state, okay? So it's like a parachute, exactly. Now, for number 7, in terms of the hindbrain, remember the reticular formation. That's a key one. That's in charge of arousal and alertness, okay? That keeps you simply active and able to process information, alert to your surroundings. Remember 8, the limbic system. This is often how it's going to be asked to you. It's the pleasure system of the brain. So this is often where dopamine is produced as well as addiction occurs. This includes your hypothalamus, which is your drive center. Your thirst drive, your hunger drive all originate in the limbic system. Other parts of the limbic system which are involved in pleasure, the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain, okay? Your hippocampus is the memory portion of your brain. All 3 work together. So that's why memories are very emotional, and that's why a lot of times food, if you're hungry, causes you to be somewhat emotional or angry, because they're all working together as a system. That's the limbic system. Now, going to the next page, okay? For number 10, association areas. Now, what's an association area? Association areas get their information from a variety of different areas of the brain. This includes the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. These are both located, which you have to know, on the left hemisphere. The Broca's area, this is in charge of producing speech. Wernicke's area is in charge of understanding communication. Now again, if the Broca's area fails, or you have Broca's aphasia, which means inability to speak, you're not going to be able to communicate. If you have Wernicke's aphasia, you're not going to be able to understand what people are saying to you. Okay? Now, going down to 13, imaging the brain. Okay? Remember, an MRI is basically used to look at tissue. It's more detail. It gets more exact. A CAT scan is just a picture of the brain, like a picture of your cat. Now a PET scan, remember that's the key one that I'll be testing you on. This is the ingestion of a radioactive gel, which is used to look at the metabolic rates of a body, how we simply process information, digest information. Okay. Now, remember, all pets drink fluid, so that's a good way to remember it. Okay, that's all for Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Developmental Psychology. Okay, this is 7 to 9 questions on the midterm. So really that's what we're going to look at. Now, starting off with number 1, looking at prenatal development. Teratogens are harmful agents that can affect the fetus. What's a harmful agent? Alcohol, for example. This is often what accounts for fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a very leading cause of mental impairment. Now, looking at nature side of development, and again, remember nature is genetics, okay? This brings into play on page 7, temperament. Temperament is simply you're born with a certain temperament, which is going to give way to personality. So what do I mean by temperament? Okay, looking at the next one, cognitive development, okay? Number 3, assimilation versus accommodation. Remember, assimilation is same schema. What schema? Or organized pattern of thought. Okay, so in other words, how we put information into these organized patterns of thought, like automatic assumptions, is same schema, or assimilation means the information has not changed the schema. It's simply blended in to the existing information that we know. Accommodation, the C stands for changes. So the information changes, okay, how we think about something. So in other words, somebody might believe that a bird has to be able to fly to be considered a bird. So when he learns penguins can't fly, but they're still considered a bird, it changes their schema of birds, what they know of birds. Now looking at number 4, Piaget's cognitive stage model. Okay, remember in sensory motor stage, the key thing is object permanence. This is searching for an object that's no longer there. Okay, so little Betty looks under the chair when she drops her ball. That's a searching behavior. Now, in the pre-operational stage, which is the next stage, this is a stage of symbolic thought. This is the kid who plays, with a stick, but it's a symbol for a sword. This often is including egocentric type of thinking. Egocentric is the inability to take in another person's point of view. So little Jimmy might sit in front of the TV and not realize he's blocking everyone else's view because he has that inability. Now in the concrete stage, the key thing is the achievement of conservations. Recognizing that although the shape changes, the amount stays the same. So if that was the classic example, if you have 2 glasses, one tall and one short, but you put the same amount of water in, someone who's achieved conservations would recognize it's still the same amount, even though the taller one looks like it has more. Now, number 6 involves a term called the critical period. The critical period means there's a certain point where things have to happen in order for development to properly occur. Like a child has to be held at birth for attachment to occur. Language has to be learned by age 11 or 12, or it might not occur at all. Now, this brought in a term by Konrad Lorenz called imprinting, that whatever a species sees first after birth, it's going to follow it along, okay? And that's, again, an example of critical period because it happens right after birth. Now, in terms of social development, this continues with the attachment theory. Harry Harlow, through his apparatuses with the 2 cages of monkeys, the monkey that had a surrogate mother draped in a warm terry cloth had more infant monkeys attached to it because it was warm. So he came up with the term contact comfort. Okay? In other words, contact contributes to attachment. Now, Mary Ainsworth wanted to measure attachment. Secure attachment was always indicated in her stranger situation example, that the child was kind of regretful to see the mother leave. In other words, cried a little when the mother left. But the key thing was, once the mother left and the child adjusted to the daycare room, the child then explored the room, played normally with its toys, and even when mother came back, here's the key thing, showed a lot of excitement to see mom again. Insecure attachment, Avoidant attachment, for example, the child runs away from mom. That's, sometimes not a good sign. Ambivalent attachment, the child will run to mom, grab to mom, but then push mom away. Again, another form of insecure attachment. Okay, going to page 8, okay, parenting styles. Okay, authoritative is considered the democratic parenting style, the very good parenting style. They have good relationships with their children, and as a result, the child becomes very competent. Competent means good, independent, and mature. Authoritarian is the parent simply is the only voice. Does not allow a child to have a decision. It's the parent's way or no way. So this is your very strict parent. Permissive, again, these parents do not take an active role in their children. Okay, the child are basically the only voice in this relationship. Okay, where the parent lets off the child do whatever they want to do. Now, for number 9, in terms of adolescence, okay, this brings on primary versus secondary sex characteristics. Primary sex characteristics are the reproductive organs that are primarily used for reproduction. That's a good way to remember it. Secondary sex characteristics are the result of the puberty process that include what defines usually the physical attributes of a man and a woman. Facial hair, okay, development of the hips in a woman, and so on. Now, in terms of morality, this is Lawrence Kohlberg. 3 levels of morality are 3 really different situations. Pre-conventional morality is pre wants to be free. Their morality, which again, morality is their reasoning or decision making, is based on avoiding punishment or gaining a reward, like ice cream. Conventional morality is based on being consistent with what other people expect you to do. Okay? This includes society, this includes your teachers, this includes parents. So why don't you cheat on a test? My teacher told me not to. You want to be consistent with their expectations. Post-conventional morality is based on individual choices and reasons. A person stands strong for what they believe in because they have their own personal viewpoints to back it up. So some people might not want to pay taxes because they believe that taxes are not beneficial. That's their belief. Okay? Now, for number 11, adult and aging, this brings in crystallized versus fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is accumulated knowledge that, again, increases throughout life. Fluid intelligence is how quickly you come up with answers, abstract reasoning. And this decreases throughout life. So fluid, when you pour it out of a glass, goes down. Now, again, with Alzheimer's, this is connected with a lack of acetylcholine. Okay, moving to page 9. This brings in the next chapter, which again is an 8 to 10% chapter. So there's 3 of them so far. History of psych, biopsych, and cognition. Now, going down to number 4, this involves short-term memory. Short-term memory, remember, is limited in capacity to 7 items plus or minus 2. And only about 20 to 30 seconds in duration, which means that's about as much time as you have to push something into long-term memory. Now, there's a couple things you can do to increase the capacity and duration of short-term memory. Chunking means taking several units and putting it into one meaningful unit, like an acronym, TGIF. You're taking 4 words, but you're using it only as one item in short-term memory. Maintenance rehearsal is basically saying the term over and over to keep it active in short-term memory. The more you repeat it, the more you start that clock over, and you get an additional 20 seconds to keep it active in short-term memory. Now, long-term memory, what passes the information from short-term to long-term? Maintenance rehearsal doesn't. Repeating an item over and over does not. Elaborative rehearsal means you're adding meaning to what is in short-term memory. Personal meaning, okay? Personal significance. This is also called semantic, which means meaning, encoding. Now, if you meet somebody that means something to you, more than likely you're going to pass their name into long-term memory because there's extra meaning behind it. So when I give you examples, analogies, William James, father of American psychology, remember Jamestown, American colony, I've added extra meaning, which is why you remember it better than if you just repeated a term before a quiz. Now, this brings us to page 10, and this brings us to types of memories. Now, you have explicit memories, which explicit memories mean these are thinking memories. You need to it requires thought to bring these out of long-term memory. Now, what are explicit memories? There's 2 types. Episodic information, which is personal information. The P in episodic stands for personal. So in other words, your birth date, your mom's, maiden name. Then there's semantic information, which again is an explicit memory because it requires thought. This is general knowledge. okay? The capital of the United States, how many tires on a car, that everybody knows. Then there's another type of memory called implicit. Implicit doesn't require thought, it just occurs without thinking. Walking, okay, riding a bike, typing on the computer are all implicit memories. Why? Because they're learned as a procedure. When you learn something as a procedure, instead of a singular fact, it becomes more implicit because it's done together. Now, there's other two examples of memory. Prospective memory is to remembering to do something in the future, like to call your mom at 6 o'clock that day. Retrospective memory, remember retrospect means past, is remembering that you did something the day before, like took out the trash. Now, going down to number 6, what affects retrieving information, pulling stuff out of long-term memory? Well, there's serial position effect. This means that most people forget items in the middle of a list. They have a tendency to remember the first part of the list, that's called primacy. And they have a tendency to remember the last part of the list, which is called recency. Now, going to number 7, there's the interference theory. Now, this was a big one in class. Proactive interference is you cannot remember something new. You cannot remember your new locker com because you keep on dialing your old locker combination. So pro means new, okay? Retroactive interference is you can't remember something old because you learned something new. That's the key word. You can't remember something old. So you cannot remember your old cell phone number from 7th grade because you've had many new cell phone numbers since then that interfere with it. Okay? Now, number 8 on this page is misinformation effect. What this is, by giving somebody misinformation, telling them they were somewhere where they really weren't, you're basically causing their memories to change. This is, again, accommodation. All right? C stands for change. So if I tried to simply say, no, you didn't get home at 11 o'clock, the reason why I would be able to do this is because of something called source amnesia. Most people, when they make a memory, do not make that memory with time or location. So that's why you can get somebody to question, were they home at 11 or was it actually midnight? Now, other types of amnesia, okay, remember, okay, anterograde amnesia is you can't form new memories because of damage to your hippocampus. So that's your example of 51st dates. Retrograde amnesia is you can't remember information prior to an injury. So if you were in a car accident at 9 o'clock in the morning, what happened before 9 o'clock, you're not going to be able to remember. After that, you would. So if you woke up at 10 o'clock in the doctor's office, you'll know that, simply if the doctor introduces himself, the doctor's name. Now, if ever that was anterograde amnesia, you would not be able to form a new memory. Now, in terms of prototype, remember prototype is the most typical thing that comes to your mind. It is your best example from a concept, which is a mental grouping. So your best example of your group of cars would be your Dodge Charger. Now, solving problems, number 11. Algorithm is a step-by-step procedure that guarantees a solution. Follow it to a T, you're going to get to your location. This is like your Yahoo map. Now, most people use heuristics. Heuristics are shortcuts because they're in a hurry. Now, the two types of heuristics I'll be testing you on. Representativeness heuristic is you make a decision based on how well the new information represents your prototype. So let's use this example. So if I told you, do you like hamburgers? If you say yes, it's because it matches your prototype of your favorite food. But if I said, do you like sushi, and that's far away from what your ideal food is, then you're going to say, no, I don't care to eat that, because it doesn't match your prototype. Availability heuristic is you make a decision based on the information that you have available to you at a present time. This is, if you know a lot about golf clubs, you have a lot of available information, you're going to make a pretty good decision when you buy those clubs. However, if you go to buy a car and you don't know much about cars, you probably will buy a car that you don't need because your available information, present information, isn't very good. So like for example with breast cancer versus cervical cancer, because people have more available information about breast cancer, they're going to say that that's more common. Now, number 12, obstacles to problem solving. Remember, functional fixedness is you cannot see an object as having more than one purpose other than the one it's designed for. So you don't realize a dime could actually turn a screw because you just see a dime as a motion of simply money. Now remember mental set. In other words, your mentality becomes set you don't see anything new. So if you keep on doing a problem wrong, you're going to keep on doing that wrong because your mentality has become set in a pattern. That's where incubation comes into place. To get up, walk away, clear your head, then come back. Now, confirmation bias. We always look for information that confirms our bias. So we want to listen to people that have the same opinions as us. And the other thing is we're going to ignore other people that disagree with us. Mentally, we shut them off once they start disagreeing with us. Now, the two new terms that we're going to cover a little bit, okay, belief perseverance is that your belief perseveres or continues despite somebody says how wrong you are. You're going to say, no, I know that's right. Even though there's so much evidence that you're wrong, your belief will persevere through the contradiction of information. This is where people get in arguments. All right, one person thinks they're right, the other person thinks they're right. They don't want to listen to each other. Belief bias, which again is a new term, is that somebody at some point told you something wrong, and it prevents you from learning the correct answer. So if somebody told you the capital of Michigan is Detroit, and you keep on, every time the capital of Michigan comes up, you say Detroit first, it's preventing you from learning, okay, that Lansing's the proper answer. Now, framing is also in this paragraph. How you frame information will influence how they answer. If I said that that yogurt was 98% fat-free, okay, that gives you one type of mental frame. But if I said it was 2% fat, I'm changing your thought about that yogurt. I, in other words, frame the information differently. Okay, going on to page 12. Now remember with language, telegraphic speech, they talk like telegraph, like a telegram. I go to, and often what they do is they use over-regularization. Now what is that? Mispronunciation of grammar. I go to the store. Instead of saying I went to the store, I sat it down. Okay? Now, also in language development is the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Remember, this is Benjamin Whorf. Now, you might not remember this term, but you probably remember that Americans have a lot of words for time. So in other words, what this means is our culture dictates the words we're going to use, which often dictates the way we think. Americans place a lot of emphasis on time. Inuits place a lot of emphasis on snow, so they have many more words than we do for snow because they're in a culture that's around it more. Now, remember with grammar, okay, morphemes are the smallest units of our language that carry meaning, like a suffix, like a prefix. Phonemes are the smallest units of our language that represent our syllables, but they don't carry meaning, okay? Now, when you put phonemes together, yeah, you make words, okay? And that's it for chapter 4. The next chapter is chapter 9, testing in individual differences. This is 5 to 7% of the exam, so there's about 5 or 6 questions coming from here. And this often deals with testing. Now, remember you're going to get a question number 2, divergent versus convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is brainstorming, coming up with as many ideas as possible. Okay, so that's good if you can't find your car keys, to simply use divergent thinking and think of every possible place they could be at. Convergent thinking is when you simply converge to one single idea, right? You basically wipe everything off the chalkboard and you're left with one example. You converge on one. Now remember on number 3, in terms of intelligence, there were some people that had thought differently on this. Charles Spearman believed in the G factor, one single factor responsible for intelligence, one single gene, one single test score that dictates our intelligence. Now, a lot of people question that because we all have different abilities. Okay, some people can dance, but they can't sing. Some people can throw a ball, but they can't study for an exam. Okay, so there are different types of intelligence, which Howard Gardner mentioned with multiple intelligence. Sternberg believed in the thinking cap. 3 areas of intelligence: creative, analytical, and practical. Creative is like your elective classes, thinking outside the box. Analytical is your book smarts, like your math and science. And then practical is your common sense, how you work with people in the environment. Okay, and that goes to page 13 now. Now, remember in terms of emotional intelligence, this is tricky, people. You have to know the difference between inter, I-N-T-E-R, personal intelligence, and intra, I-N-T-R-A, personal intelligence. Interpersonal is the ability to read everybody else's emotions. So the E stands for everybody else's emotion. The A in intra means our emotions. So we always give ourselves an A, and that's a good way to remember it. Now remember in terms of measuring intelligence, Alfred Binet wrote the first intelligence test. So yes, that's right, we strive to get an A or B on the test. His test was originally designed to place children in terms of their special needs and what they'll do or be able to do in the future. So it was more aptitude. Now remember, the Wechsler test, okay, the WAIS test, is the most common used intelligence test because it looks at our verbal and our performance abilities. Now, in terms of the Stanford-Binet, okay, now this was a big test, all right, it was mental age, okay, and this was simply Lewis Terman, okay, adapted the Stanford-Binet test. But Wilhelm Stern came up with the rule, mental age over chronological age times 100 equals intelligence. So your mental age is where you're supposed to be at a certain age. So if you're 7, chronologically, you should have a mental age of 7, and of course then you'd have 100 IQ. Now remember with test construction, okay, these are instruments to see if the test is good. Reliability is you give the test over and over, you should get the same results. Now how do you test reliability? Test, retest, give the test once in the fall, give the test again in the spring, and the results should be the same. Some people use split half, where they look at the odd questions versus the even questions, and when you add those scores up, they should be the same. Now validity, the test measures what it's supposed to measure. Content validity, what that means is if we're talking about psychology, then the test questions should be about the content of psychology. Criterion or predictive validity is an interesting one. There could be questions on the psychology test that can make predictions for how you'll do on future tests. So I might design a question very similar to one that's possible on the national exam. And if you got number 7 right, that's an indication that you probably will do well on the national exam. Now, remember in terms of standardization. Standardization means you give the test to a previous group. They set the standard, and that other groups down the road are going to be compared to. Now, this means that you taking the test down the road are taking it under the same conditions as the original group that the standardization is based on. Time-wise, time of the day, how many questions, and so on. Now remember with number 8, aptitude versus achievement test. Aptitude tests make predictions, okay, like the ACT, good job. The achievement test measure what you're supposed to know. So the C in achievement stands for see what I know, okay? So your psych test this Friday is an achievement test, measuring what you're supposed to know in this course. Okay. Now moving to page 14. Number 12, statistical significance, means that the results can be backed up by numbers. Okay, it's not determined by luck or chance. There's actual data to back up the claim. Okay, so that's the numbers. I always say the scale doesn't lie. The scale on, the weight on the scale is your weight. There is no, other factors that go into it. Now, that brings up chapter 5, motivation, emotion, and stress. That's 7 to 9%. Okay, we're on page 14, motivation, emotion, and stress. Okay, number 1 with homeostasis. Homeostasis means an internal state. Okay, so homeostasis monitors the internal states of our body and maintains them. It alerts the brain when things change. So when body temperature goes up, it alerts the brain. This is often the backbone of the drive reduction theory. Okay, in other words, what motivates us to get out of bed and get a drink of water? It's basically our need for water, okay, is not being met, which drives us to reduce that need, or to reduce that drive by satisfying the need. So again, drive reduction theory. What motivates us? The motivation is we have biological needs, and when those needs are not being met, that simply produces tension in our body called thirst or hunger. Okay, that simply drives us to reduce the drive. So that's why it's called drive reduction. Now remember with number 2, Maslow. Humanistic psychologists believe that they want the person, to be the best human they can be. They believe this is through a healthy self-concept, which is the collection of beliefs you have about yourself, okay, and the pursuit of self-actualization. Now what is self-actualization? Being the best or doing the best with what you have. Now how do you reach self-actualization? What Maslow said was by satisfying each level in the hierarchy of needs. In other words, the bottom level was physiological needs, which is your food and water. He basically said if you don't satisfy those, you cannot then satisfy the next levels, which include obviously safety, then love and belongingness, and eventually cognitive. So when people say, I gotta get something to eat or I can't study, that's exactly what the hierarchy of needs are. Okay? Going to number 4, the incentive theory. This involves intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is the motivation is within. You have your own personal reasons for doing it. Makes you feel good. Extrinsic motivation is you need something extra to motivate you. Money, extra credit, stickers, so on. Okay? Now, the over-justification effect is an interesting one, and this is a new concept. The point is, if somebody starts out playing basketball because they love to play basketball, that's intrinsic motivation. However, if they start getting paid to play basketball, like a professional athlete, what happens is this new extrinsic motivation will simply overshadow the intrinsic motivation. In other words, what will happen as a result is they will only play basketball for the extrinsic motivation. The intrinsic motivation is gone. Now, number 5, industrial organizational psychologists. This is a branch of psychology that looks at improving worker performance and satisfaction. They're not really concerned with corporate profitability. They want to make the workers do the best they can in particular positions. So they'll put a person in a position where they think they will be the happiest, but be the happiest in terms of their work for the company as well. Now, this goes on to page 15. Okay, and this deals with number 7, hunger. Lateral versus ventral medial hypothalamus. Lateral hypothalamus initiates hunger. So the L stands for let's eat. You destroy it, the rat's never going to eat. Ventral medial hypothalamus is simply stopping hunger. Okay? So in other words, this is satiation or fullness. Destroy it, okay? And basically what's going to happen is the rat will not stop eating. Okay? Because there's nothing there to tell them to stop. Now, going down to number 8, the set point theory. This is an example of homeostasis. Set point means you have an ideal weight. Let's say it's 165. Homeostasis monitors this 165. That's your set point. When it fluctuates, homeostasis alerts the brain, which then alerts the lateral hypothalamus or the ventral medial hypothalamus. So if you're 166 and you drop to 165, guess what? Exactly. The lateral hypothalamus gets turned on, and you will eat till you go back up to 166. Now, in terms of theories of emotion, the 2 that I'm going to be testing you on, the James Lange theory basically says that emotion comes from a change in the body, period. Your heart starts to race, and because of that alone, you get scared. Now, of course, there's a problem with that. Your heart can race for a number of emotions. So there's got to be more to it. This is the problem with polygraphs. Polygraphs just measure changes in the body. They really don't indicate whether a person is lying or not, okay? They look at how much there's the change in the body. And that's a clue to maybe they are lying, but you can't say for sure. The 2-factor theory of emotion, also called the Stanley Schachter theory, basically says there's a change in the body, and this is the key point, people, but there's a cognitive label to why there's a change in the body. So my heart is racing, and you provide a cognitive label to why your heart's racing, because you're about ready to ask somebody to prom. Okay? So that cognitive label is a label of why there's a change in your body. And that label dictates the right type of emotion. So I am scared because my heart's racing, okay, because I'm about to, ask somebody to prom. You are identifying why there's a change in your body. So in other words, brain and body are the 2 factors. Now, that's different than the cognitive mediational theory. That's interpreting the situation. So in other words, somebody walking behind me, you interpret that situation as scary, okay, because you don't know who the person is. So you feel scared because that's how you interpreted the situation. Okay, moving on to page 16. Okay, looking at number 11 with stress. Reacting to stress. This involves Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. Okay, GAS. All right, now there's 3 stages: the alarm stage, the resistive stage, and the exhaustive stage. The alarm stage is fight or flight, the release of basically catecholamines that make you all excited. This is when the immediate stress affects you. A car accident, bad news, this is the alarm stage. However, after the release of the catecholamines, what happens is your body starts to fight the stress. This is called the resistive stage, the release of corticosteroids. What do corticosteroids do? It gives you energy. It allows you to stay up late at night and get the test done or get the homework done. However, it comes with a price. Corticosteroids lower your immune system. Okay, so as a result, you're more vulnerable to getting sick. Now, the last stage, the exhaustive stage, is simply when your body can't fight back anymore. And this is where you're more prone to serious illness, okay? That may require hospitalization or bed rest, okay? Moving on to page 17, okay? The catharsis theory, okay, is Freud's theory, that we have to release our aggression every once in a while through acceptable types of activities. Playing football, which is an aggressive sport, Freud would like because it gets your aggression out. People that bottle it all up inside are more prone to get sick, according to Freud. Okay, now, that's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is sensation and perception, and this is 7 to 9% of the exam. So again, 7 to 9 questions. Now, sensation and perception starts off with the difference between bottom-up versus top-down processing. This is how we simply perceive or interpret information. Bottom-up processing is you look at the individual parts and put them together to give you an interpretation of what you're looking at. So this is a person that looks at each piece of a puzzle, and by putting them together, gets the image of the puzzle. Top-down processing is when you use previous experiences or memories to interpret what you're looking at. So you look at the picture on the box to see what the puzzle pieces are. You use previous knowledge. Another example of top-down processing is, again, this is past memories. So if somebody says to you, do you want to try sushi? Your answer is based on what people have told you in the past. Bottom-up processing, you would actually try it, okay, and use your senses to figure out what it is. Now, number 2 is absolute and thresholds. Absolute threshold is a minimum amount of stimulation that's necessary for you to detect a stimulus. In other words, what does that mean? Hear something, see something, taste something, feel something. Difference threshold is there has to be a minimum of enough of a difference between two things, minimum amount of a change or variation for you to detect that difference. So there is a minimum amount of difference between Coke and Pepsi for you to say one is Coke and one is Pepsi. Now this brings into play Weber's law. The key word is proportion. In other words, Weber's law explains the difference threshold. And what it says is if one stimulus gets louder, the other stimulus must get proportionally louder for the difference to remain. So in other words, if you're at a concert with your friend and you're talking at a level based on the background noise. However, if the background noise starts to get louder, in proportion, you're going to have to get as loud for your friend to tell the difference between your voice and the band playing on the stage. Now, number 3 deals with the parts of the eye. The retina is where transduction takes place. Transduction is when physical energy is converted into neural code. Now, what does that mean? Light waves have to be converted into some type of information that the brain can understand. So it's a very important part of the eye. But this is also where the photoreceptors are located. What are photoreceptors? They respond to light waves, which allow us to pick up energy from our environment and see it. Now remember, cones are involved in fine details, color vision, okay, and bright lights. And they are stored in the fovea, which is the center point of the eye, which is why we look something head on when we're trying to look for details. Rods are for peripheral vision and dim light. They're located in the sides of the eye. Now, they're not as acute or exact as cones, which is why we can't see very good in the dark. And they're very slow, which means a lot of times we don't see things right away when the lights get turned out. Now, going to page 18, okay, this deals with color vision. There's 2 theories. Trichromatic theory basically means there's 3 types of cones. A red cone, red sensitive cone, green sensitive cone, and blue sensitive. Red sensitive means it's sensitive to longer wavelengths, which is your reddish colors. Green cone means it's sensitive to medium wavelengths, which is your greenish colors. And blue is short wavelengths, which is simply your bluish colors. When these cones are activated, and they're activated in a certain way where they come on together, that's what produces all different types of colors. The other theory, the opponent process theory, this basically says that there's opponent pairs. Red, green, okay, black, white, okay, and blue, yellow. When we see red, red is turned on, green is off, okay? Now an after image, if you stared at a red dot, after a while you would exhaust that red dot or red cone and the green cone would come back on and you would basically see a green dot. Now, for number 5 in terms of audition or hearing, the middle ear, remember, is the mechanical portion of the ear. This has three tiny bones, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Has. Okay, now, this was what amplifies sound. What you have to know is, this is when conduction hearing loss can take place. Now, this is damage to the middle ear. The good thing is hearing aids will help in this. Sensory neural hearing loss involves the inner ear. Now, what is the inner ear? Very similar to the retina. This is where transduction takes place. Now, within the inner ear is the cochlea. It's kind of like a snail shape. Now, the cochlea is lined by the basilar membrane. Now, in this basilar membrane are hair cells. If these hair cells get damaged, you have sensory neural hearing loss. And unfortunately, this is somewhat permanent. Because again, that's where transduction takes place. There would be nothing to convert the sound waves into neural code. Okay, now number 6 on page 18 is the vestibular sense. This sense is in charge of balance, okay, head position and balance. Now again, the information is coming from the inner ear, specifically the semicircular canal and vestibular sac. When that fluid starts moving in the semicircular canals, you're going to feel dizzy. That's why we hold on to things to keep that fluid from moving. Okay, going to page 19. Number 9, the gate control theory of pain basically says that there are neurological gates in our spinal cord. And it's very simple to explain to you. When the gate is open, we feel pain. When the gate is closed, we don't. Now, what closes the gate? Sometimes, for example, distraction, Lamaze, not focusing on the pain. But when the gate is open, you're going to feel the pain, okay? Because remember, those signals are going directly up your spinal cord. Now, number 10, the kinesthetic sense. This is simply monitoring our body position. This is why we're able to wiggle our toes and know we're doing it without seeing our feet, or moving our fingers and not realizing with our eyes that we're actually doing that, okay? Now, the next part is perception. Gestalt psychology looks at perception, how we perceive things, how we make sense out of things. They believe the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So this is why we don't cut a wedding cake, because as a whole figure, it looks greater than if you cut it into small pieces. Now, they also looked at figure-ground relationship. In other words, to perceive something, we separate the object, which is the figure, from the background, okay? So in other words, if we see a boat on the ocean, the boat is the figure, and our brain separates it from the ocean, which is the background, in order for us to make sense out of it. Now, this also brings in linear perspective. In other words, a lot of times when we see lines, this is like railroad tracks, in the distance we see them converging together, and that's called linear perspective. Now, for number 12, depth perception. Depth perception, basically what the whole point of Eleanor Gibson, okay, and Richard Walk's experiment was to see if it was innate. You're born with depth perception. And because of the visual cliff, they demonstrated or proved it right. Little babies would not cross the plexiglass when they were coaxed by their parent to come over. In other words, they looked down and they got scared and they backed up. Okay? Moving on to the next page, number 13. The word constancy means constant. An example of this that you have to know for the test is size constancy. Size constancy means, like for a door, when it opens and closes, the size changes. But we know it's the same door, even though the image is looking different to us. Okay? And that's called constancy. So even though the image moves back and forth, we still know it's the same object moving back and forth. Now, phi phenomenon is an interesting term under number 14. In other words, how you turn lights on and off, especially the speed, can often show direction. So if you turn on the light bulb slow and then increase the speed of turning them on, it will actually show direction, like a scoreboard and the ball getting shot through the screen. Okay? Now, 15, cocktail party effect. What that means is, why it's called the cocktail party effect, is you can focus on a conversation that you're having, but still be aware of everything else that's going on in the room. So you know that people are leaving, coming, and going, but you're able to do two things at once. Intentional blindness is when simply your inability to detect an object or a voice or someone saying something to you because you've been distracted. So it's the opposite of the cocktail party effect. Okay, that's all for chapter 6. The next chapter, states of consciousness. This is a very small chapter, 2 to 4 questions. Now, number 2, you have to know what a circadian rhythm is. This is a fluctuation in a body, like body temperature. Body temperature goes up and body temperature goes down within a 24 to 25 hour period of the day. We have a tendency to drift to a 25-hour day, okay, because of if there's no environmental cues, okay? Now, this often involves the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which remember, that's a sensor in your hypothalamus that receives information from your retina regarding light. When it receives information that it's becoming light out, it decreases the amount of melatonin produced by the pineal gland. When simply it detects darkness, it increases melatonin, and what that happens is that's what makes you tired, okay? Now, looking down at number 5, remember REM sleep stands for rapid eye movement. What's significant about this? Well, that's where dreams occur. That's when your brain is showing beta waves, which means you're wide awake, which is why you can remember your dreams. But it's also called paradoxical sleep because that's because your body is completely asleep. Okay, so it's a paradox. One's up and then one's asleep. Now, remember in terms of dreams, Freud's interpretation of dream book said there was 2 parts to a dream. The manifest part of a dream is what you can remember. That's the story. That's what you tell your friends you had a dream about. The latent content, Freud believed, was the symbolic activity, which basically means a symbol to things in the unconscious. Now, number 9 deals with drugs and alcohol. Okay, tolerance is the more you do of a drug, the more you're going to need. Your tolerance is increased. Now, when you don't get a drug that simply your body has become addicted to or dependent on, you experience withdrawal symptoms, okay, like headaches, and so on, okay? Now, the last one, number 10, involves Ernest Hilgard's neo-dissociational theory of hypnosis. He believed that in hypnosis, you can produce 2 streams of consciousness. One stream is you're aware that you're being hypnotized, and a second stream is called the hidden observer, which in other words, it's like basically putting a fork in a stream and producing another stream. That stream is what they tap into, called the hidden observer, which is representative of the unconscious. You're unaware of what they're doing in that stream. That's so when they say when you wake up, you're no longer going to be hungry. You didn't hear that because that was going towards your second stream. However, your first stream is you're being hypnotized overall. Okay, in terms of the next chapter, learning. Okay, this is 7 and 9%, and I'm on the bottom of page 21. This involves classical conditioning. Okay, now remember, unconditioned means not learned, automatic. Okay, this is unconditioned stimulus is simply a stimulus that automatically causes something to occur. What is that something to occur? That is called a response. So in this particular case, it's the unconditioned response. So in other words, if somebody shoots a puff of air in your eye, the puff of air is the stimulus because it will automatically cause your eyelids to close. That's the response. So again, the puff of air is called an unconditioned stimulus, and the fluttering of your eyes is the response. Now, remember conditioned. The conditioned word means learned. See what I've learned. Now, just to start this over, let's use the invisible fence example that we know so well. A shock will automatically cause a dog to yelp. So the shock is called the unconditioned stimulus, and the yelping is called the unconditioned response. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does nothing, the end for nothing. So in this particular example, let's say a tone. The dog hears a tone, it does nothing. However, if you present the tone and then right after the shock, so the timing is the neutral stimulus comes first, then the unconditioned stimulus, what eventually will happen is the dog is going to learn that the tone is simply hinting that the unconditioned stimulus, which is the shock, is going to come. So eventually, the tone goes from neutral stimulus to a learned stimulus called the conditioned stimulus. Now, because the dog is responding to the tone, the response, which is the yelping, is now called the conditioned response. Okay? Now let's look at some other terms that we covered. Stimulus generalization is, generally speaking, other stimuli resemble that conditioned stimulus. So other tones are very similar because they cause the dog to yelp. That's the conditioned response, okay, which is the conditioned response. Now discrimination is there's enough of a difference between another stimulus and the original one, which in this example is the tone, that the dog doesn't respond, the dog doesn't yelp, so that's called discrimination. Now remember extinction, that's been a tricky one. Extinction is, let's look back at the example. Why is the dog responding to the tone? Because the tone basically predicts that a shock is going to come. So how do we get the dog not to respond to the tone anymore? We eliminate what the dog expects to happen, which in this particular case is the shock. So we eliminate, take away the shock, the unconditioned stimulus. You will extinguish or stop the dog yelping. Why? You're presenting the tone, there's no more shock. The dog has now learned, wait, this shock is no longer coming, so the tone doesn't mean anything to me. However, it becomes a memory, which means the dog doesn't forget. So in reconditioning, which would be reintroducing, okay, the shock after the tone, what the dog all of a sudden will happen is once you present the tone and then the shock comes back in reconditioning, the dog's going to quickly learn, okay, that tone indicates the shock is coming again. Now when the dog yelps again to the tone alone, that's called spontaneous recovery. Okay. Very good, guys. Now, that brings in number 3, operant conditioning on the bottom of page 22. Operant conditioning means how an organism operates depends on what it gets after it performs a behavior. So if you raise your hand and get extra credit after you raise your hand, you are going to continue to operate by raising your hand because of what followed. This all comes from Edward Thorndike's law of effect. Behaviors that are rewarded with extra credit are going to be behaviors that are going to be repeated. Behaviors that are punished are going to be behaviors that are going to be eliminated. Now, B.F. Skinner demonstrated this with the shaping theory. By giving extra credit or extra positive reinforcement to anybody will increase their behavior of simply towards that desired goal. Now, this brings in number 4, positive versus negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, the addition of a favorable stimulus, like extra credit, after a child raises their hand, notice I said addition, that's positive, will increase the chances of the kid raising their hand. Negative reinforcement also increases behavior, but you're taking away something undesirable. So taking away having to take this midterm Friday would increase you, if I made it contingent on coming to a review, of you coming to every review prior to that. Okay, so again, negative reinforcement, a good example. Why do you fasten your seatbelt? The removal of that annoying buzzer following you buckling your seatbelt increases the chances of you wearing your seatbelt down the road. Punishment decreases behavior. Positive punishment is the addition, okay, the addition of an unfavorable stimulus like chores following a bad behavior will eventually decrease you doing that behavior again. Negative punishment is taking away something favorable like your Friday night activity following a bad behavior, again decreasing your behavior. Now remember, types of reinforcement for number 5. Primary reinforcers are biological reinforcers, food and water. These are very specially used with animals. Secondary reinforcers are learned reinforcers. This is money, extra credit, stickers. You had to learn those, to learn the power of those for them to have an effect on you. Now remember 6, the schedules of reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is giving reinforcement every single time they raise their hand. Very good for quick learning. However, once you stop giving that extra credit, it's not going to simply work out very well because the child will simply stop trying. So it leads to extinction or simply not performing a behavior very quickly. Late or partial reinforcement schedules is giving reinforcement once in a while. This keeps a person guessing as we go to page 23, which means that they're going to continue to perform the behavior because they don't know whether or not they're going to get that reinforcement. Now this brings in several partial reinforcement schedules. Okay? When you look at fixed ratio, fixed means a set number. Ratio means behaviors performed. So after buying 5 cups of coffee, your 6th one's free. Variable ratio is like a slot machine. You pull that lever a certain amount of times, unpredictable number of times, then you get your payout. But you just don't know what the number is. You could pull it 2 times or 50 times. Variable interval, remember interval is time. So after a varying amount of time, you simply get reinforcement. So they will let you know after, a certain amount of time that you don't know when they're going to pay you. Fixed interval means every 30 minutes you're paid. Okay? Now, remember, latent learning is learning that takes place, but it's later shown, like in a football game, when there's reinforcement given. Okay? Number 9, observational learning, involved Albert Bandura and his Bobo doll. This means that simply how we observe. What's important here is when we observe somebody getting rewarded, we will model or do the same thing as their behavior. Okay? Okay, we are up to chapter 10, personality chapter. And this is 5 to 7% of the exam, so again, 5 to 7 questions. A big chunk of this chapter deals with the psychodynamic approach, which again, this is Sigmund Freud's area of expertise, which again, everything is revolving around the unconscious. And this includes his personality theory, which basically broke down personality into 3 parts. The id, which is basically based on the pleasure principle. You're born with, demands immediate gratification. The ego, which is considered the decision maker, which again is based on the reality principle. Often what is meant by that, delaying the gratification of the id to a more appropriate time. And then the superego is simply your morals and conscience, your internal voice of, reason. Now, in terms of defense mechanisms, which is obviously a big, a couple questions in this chapter, seems to be the most confusing part. Remember, repression is one of the most studied because this is automatically, unconsciously pushing down unwanted behavior into the unconscious, which obviously when we talk about therapy is what they try to resolve. Also regression, another type of defense mechanism. And again, defense mechanisms reduce anxiety. That's brought on by conflicts between the id and the superego. Regression is you revert back to or go back to an infantile time period where you simply, in other words, crying, throwing a temper tantrum is simply easing the anxiety. Now, reaction formation, the key word is opposite. In other words, people perform or think, behave in an opposite way of how they truly feel. So somebody who has affection for somebody might actually ridicule the person and put them down. Now, the ones that people confuse are projection and displacement. Projection is, again, the word projecting, which is directing your insecurities onto another person. In other words, your insecurity of not being in a relationship, you have a tendency to always make fun of other people's relationships because you're projecting your insecurity. That's often the bully syndrome, okay? They're jealous of a person for some reason and they try to bring them down to their level of insecurity. Displacement, on the other hand, is when you basically physically take out your aggression on an object, situation, or person that cannot fight back. That's not a threat to you. So this could be a locker, this could be a wall. It's something that you simply displace your aggression. So in other words, you get upset with your teacher, you can't say anything to your teacher, you displace your anger onto another person. Now, sublimation, the final defense mechanism, is you find a substitute. Sublimation, substitute. You find a substitute, like playing football, to get out your aggression. Sublimation is very similar to catharsis. Remember, catharsis is displaying or releasing your aggression in acceptable ways. Now, remember, Neo-Freudians were people that followed Freud. Okay, these were people that they wanted to distance themselves from Freud, but they still believed in the roles that he was, talking about. Now, Alfred Adler, you always look at the fact that he believes superiority was simply our motivation to overcome our childhood inferiority. So in other words, that's why we get resistant. When someone wants to help us, we say, no, we can do it. Carl Jung believed in the collective unconscious. In other words, shared information that's passed from generation to generation. So in other words, each generation comes with, so to speak, information, okay, that helps them to survive. Now, in this collective unconscious is archetypes. We're born with understanding symbols. For example, snakes represent evil, okay? Now, the humanistic perspective on personality believes that personality revolves around a person's self-concept, the beliefs that they have about themselves. That's simply their self-concept. Now, what affects the self-concept is 2 components. Unconditional positive regard, which is people like you no matter what. They like your self-concept no matter what you do, they believe in you. Conditional positive regard is basically they show you affection when you meet certain conditions. Now, how this affects the self-concept is if you have the belief that you have to meet someone's conditions in order to get their affection, you may distort who you are and lie and basically say, yes, I won the game, just because you know that's the only way you can get affection. Now, this brings us all the way down to the trait theory. Remember, traits, our personality traits, are consistent and stable adjectives. A person's caring, they're caring throughout their entire life. Raymond Cattell basically used a factor analysis, which is a mathematical formula to show how one trait is related to other traits. So if somebody is dependable, that person's probably already trustworthy and caring. So one trait predicts another trait. This is what Match.com and other dating services do. They show how one trait, okay, adventurous, can lead to simply this type of personality. Now, remember the big 5 source traits. In other words, people can be described by 5 source traits, and that is ocean: openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and extroversion and neuroticism. Okay, so just remember ocean. Now, the last part of this deals with the social cognitive perspective. This perspective believes that environment affects a person's behavior, and that behavior affects the way that person thinks. This is Albert Bandura's reciprocal determinism. One affects the other. So in other words, environment, okay, the environment that you're in would affect the way you act, which would affect the way you think. So if you go to a social event, okay, where you don't know anybody, you are going to act differently. And as a result, that's going to affect your thinking. You might not have as much confidence because you don't know anybody. Now, what I'm referring to with the thinking portion are self-efficacy beliefs. These are the beliefs you have about yourself or your abilities before you do something. Someone that has high self-efficacy believes in themselves and usually is pretty successful. They behave in a more positive way. Now, remember external locus of control versus internal locus of control. External locus of control is like surgery. You don't have any control. Your control basically is based on outside forces, which is what leads to more anxiety. Internal locus of control, if you believe that you control your own destiny, you're going to have a more positive personality. You're going to be more assertive, okay? Now, measuring personality, remember the Rorschach test measures the unconscious. It's a projective test. You're projecting your unconscious. Rorschach test is simply ink blots. Okay, remember the TAT test, the thematic apperception test. This test, also a projective test, but it measures a person's need for achievement, okay? So by looking at a scene, which is what simply, the thematic apperception test is, you're supposed to look at the scene and then say what you see, okay? Now, an objective test or self-report inventory, these are the most common tests because, one, they're like multiple choice tests. They're very easy to give. The most common is the MMPI test, okay? And this is 500 true-false questions. True-false questions. Okay, that's chapter 10. Now, the next chapter, 11, abnormal psychology, okay? This is 7 to 9 questions. Now, this is categorized into groups. Anxiety disorders is you have to separate the disorders. Now, there's generalized anxiety disorder, which is basically people are generally afraid of everything. Okay, then there's phobias. Phobias, the key word is irrational. They have an irrational fear of objects, situations. Now, agoraphobia, one of the more common ones, is agoraphobia is a fear of leaving your house. You're a fear of open places. This is due to the fact you might have a panic attack in public and you don't have any control over it. So panic disorder often leads to agoraphobia, not leaving their house. And that is just unexplainable panic attacks. Now, remember, obsessive compulsive disorder is often a person's obsessive thoughts about something directs compulsive types of behaviors, ritualistic behaviors, washing your hands, several hundred times a day. Basically, it's an anxiety disorder because there's a thought that's causing so much anxiety. The only way you can combat this anxiety is by doing something that distracts you, like a ritualistic behavior. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. This is often a person who has problems with the traumatic event to the point where they feel like they're reliving that event on a daily basis, which often prevents them from doing what they're meant to do in a productive life. Now, remember, mood disorders affect a person's mood swings or a mood, like their emotions. Major depression is a very debilitating type of disorder. Often a person is not in a position where they can take care of their family, work at a job or go to school. Now, dysthymic depression is a lower grade depression, and the difference is this tends to be 2-3 years in duration. Now, bipolar, remember this is also a mood disorder, and we're going to the next page on page 26. But bipolar means there's two emotions, okay? Mania, which is extreme amounts of excitement, and then circulating or rotating with major depression, okay? Now, dissociative disorders. The main thing that a dissociative disorder disrupts is a person's memory. So in other words, somebody with dissociative identity disorder has no memory of the other personality that's coexisting in their body. It's like a wall that goes up in their mind. Now, again, this is distinct as well as unique personalities. Each personality is not aware of the other. Now, in terms of somatoform disorders, soma means body. These are people that have somatoform disorders, have physical problems, okay, without physical causes. In other words, in their mind, this has produced a physical cause. This may be the inability to move their arms, their legs, but again, there's no physical reason why they shouldn't be able to use their arms. What I just gave an example of, which is classified under the somatoform disorder, is a conversion disorder. They convert psychological pain into physical symptoms. Now, schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. In other words, there's a break in their mind between reality and fiction. They experience positive symptoms, which are delusions and hallucinations. Remember, delusions are false beliefs. Hallucinations, the most common, being auditory. Now, why it's positive is you add this to somebody, it makes them schizophrenic. Negative symptoms are simply normal types of functioning. Cognition. So in other words, you take away their cognition, take away their speech, take away their pleasure, and you leave them with schizophrenia. Now, remember, the main reason why somebody experiences schizophrenia is it's connected with the overproduction of dopamine. Dopamine is responsible for the positive symptoms, okay? Now, in terms of personality disorders, just a few you'll get a question on. Remember, borderline is instability of emotions. The person displays emotions that are not consistent with their behavior. In other words, with borderline, you don't know what you're going to get from this person. Now, the most studied was antisocial. Okay, and antisocial, basically, they have no regard for other people. That's why it makes them dangerous, is why it's so much studied. Now remember, personality disorders are an axis 2 of the DSM. What is the DSM? It's a classification of basically mental disorders, but it allows psychologists to use common language and common treatments in obviously treating people. Remember, axis 1 deals with simple mood disorders as well as anxiety disorders. Personality disorders are on axis 2 because they're lifelong. Now, this takes us to page 27. Okay, which our next chapter is methods of therapy. And this is 5 to 7 questions. The methods of therapy chapter is all about sorting the treatments with what they believe the cause is. Psychoanalysis believes that a person's disorders are the result of unconscious problems. So their techniques are looking at unsolving the unconscious. For example, free association, a person says whatever comes to their mind. The hope is that eventually they'll lose track of what they're talking about and basically reveal unconscious types of conflicts. Resistance is when a person unconsciously blocks, okay, or does not want to talk about and avoids a certain topic, maybe like a relationship in the past. This also often gives the psychoanalyst a clue that this could be an unconscious problem. Transference is one of the more interesting as well as more important. This is when the client basically directs their emotions onto the therapist. This could be hostility, this could be affection, which basically were meant for the person, okay, that caused it. So in other words, they almost see the psychoanalyst as their, past mother, father, and they start speaking to the psychoanalyst as if they are talking to their mother or father. Obviously, they're unveiling a lot of inner conflicts with that technique. Now, remember psychoanalysis, the drawback is it's very long-term and it's very expensive, which is why people go to a psychodynamic therapist, which means a short-term version of psychoanalysis. Now, humanistic perspective believes self-awareness is the main reason why somebody experiences disorders. Now, Carl Rogers developed a technique called client-centered therapy, which was a humanistic approach. His belief is that the client should be active and direct the session. In other words, the therapist should be very quiet and not very directive. The hope is that the client will reveal their problem on their own, but also find a solution for their problem, which will obviously increase their self-awareness and their self-esteem. Now, behavioral therapy believes what is learned can be unlearned. Now, counter-conditioning is simply looking at the fact, why does somebody have a fear, especially phobias? So let's look at this from a perspective, okay? If, for example, what I shared, a couple examples in class, somebody takes a neutral stimulus, okay? If we looked at, for example, little Albert, that's a better example. He took a neutral stimulus like a white rat and expected to hear a loud noise after he saw the white rat. That's why he was basically, that neutral stimulus became a conditioned stimulus, because little Albert expected to hear the loud noise. So when you used extinction, you removed the loud noise, but that all it did was suppress it. If you were going to use counter conditioning, what you would do is, obviously little Albert expects to hear a loud noise, so you would counter that, you would switch it. So in other words, when that white rat would come out, you would present maybe ice cream or a puppy or something that gives pleasure. And this basically would teach Albert not to, expect the loud noise, but now something pleasurable. Now, what I just described was systematic desensitization. People come in with their phobias and they make a list from basically least stressful to most stressful. Now, in the systematic process, they are taught relaxation techniques. So anytime when they're going through the list, they experience anxiety, they're basically taught to experience or simply display their control scene in their mind. So if my heart starts racing because I'm about to have to reach out and touch the snake, instead of thinking of the fact I'm going to get bit, I think of my control scene. And that helps me to get through that process. Now, remember aversive conditioning. This is basically pairing a once pleasurable stimulus, like let's say, for example, for a person smoking, with a basically harmful reaction, like, for example, getting sick. So in other words, somebody smokes a cigarette. They've associated that with pleasure. With aversive conditioning, you want them to associate it with an aversive type of response, which would obviously be getting sick. So somebody who gets sick from smoking probably is not going to do it again. Now, behavior modification means modifying a person's behavior. This includes operant conditioning techniques. For example, positive reinforcement. The addition of a stimulus, a favorable stimulus following behavior, increases that behavior occurring again, okay, which we talked about. Now, a couple techniques that this describes or leads to is token economics. Token economics is the use of positive reinforcement. You are given a token, a favorable stimulus, after you raise your hand in class. You basically will raise your hand again. This token can be used then to exchange for something you want from a store, school store, or so on. Extinction, another operant technique, is sometimes little kids will cry because they want their parents' attention. So extinction is you don't give them what they want. You ignore them, okay? And eventually, you're going to extinguish their crying behavior because they're not getting what they want, okay? Which brings us to page 28. Now, this also looks at cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy believes that thinking is a person's problem. In other words, what it leads to a disorder. This brought in Albert Ellis's rational emotive therapy, the ABC model. Ellis believed, that the activating event, is not the reason why someone feels or experiences a C, consequence, which would be in this case depression. He believed that a person's irrational beliefs were the problem. So in other words, if a person didn't go to prom, what they would say is, if a person asks, why are you depressed? I didn't go to prom. It's not that. It's that person's beliefs on why they didn't go to prom. In other words, if you said, well, everybody thought you had a boyfriend or girlfriend, well, even though they're still not going to prom, they feel better because they have a different belief. Now, on the next page, talking about the last part, psychiatrists obviously have medical degrees, they can issue medication. Now, some of the common medications used, neuroleptics treat schizophrenia, or they're basically called antipsychotic medications. Prime example of this is Thorazine. The problem with Thorazine is Thorazine does alleviate, or basically reduce, the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. In the process of doing this, it's by lowering the amount of dopamine. But as you know in class, this produces Parkinson's symptoms, which we call tardive dyskinesia, okay? So when you look at the other part is with SSRIs, okay, or selective serotonin reuptakers. These are used to simply antidepressants. Now, what they do is they slow down the reuptake process. So in other words, what happens is why someone experiences depression is the sending neuron doesn't allow their message to get to the next neuron. It reabsorbs it back. So these antidepressants slow that process down. Now the last one from this chapter, community psychologists, are people that go out into the community and try to do things to prevent mental disorders from occurring. Okay? Their main thing is preventative care. Okay. This brings us to our last chapter, social psychology. And again, this is 8 to 10 questions, so it's a big chapter. Now remember, okay, looking at page 28, number 3, self-fulfilling prophecy is a person is told something or they have a belief. What happens is if that belief, if they start to get evidence that shows or supports that belief, then they will fulfill their prophecy and basically start acting in accordance with that belief. Now what did that mean? If you tell somebody they're going to fail in college, they will probably dismiss it. But if all of a sudden they start to get some evidence, they fail a couple tests, they start saying these words, well, maybe it was true. Maybe it was meant to be that I shouldn't go to college. In other words, they're fulfilling the prophecy. Now, the attribution theory, how we attribute behavior, in other words, attribute means to explain. There's often some things we do that could be correct or incorrect. First of all, you have to know the difference between a dispositional attribution, which again is a personal trait, P for personality, and a situational attribution, which means a situational factor outside of the person. Now, if you commit the fundamental attribution error, what happens is you are not taking the situation into consideration. So when you say he's a bad driver because he simply has no coordination, you are attacking the person. You're attacking their disposition without taking into fact maybe there was a situational factor, like somebody cut him off. In other words, fundamental attribution error is assumptions. Okay? Now, another error we make is the actor-observer bias. In other words, when we pass the exam, we give ourselves credit. So we thank our dispositional factor. Okay? However, when we are failing at something, we often blame it on a situational factor. So if we failed the test, we say it was too much noise in the classroom. We blame it on a situational factor. However, when our friend comes up to us and says, well, I also failed that test, in your mind, you don't give them the same situational excuse that it was noisy. What you say is, well, yes, but you did not study enough. You blame that person's disposition. Now, this also leads to the self-serving bias. When we're successful, we thank our dispositional factor. We're smart, we're good, whatever. When we fail, we blame the situation. This also is blaming the victim a lot of times. We say people get what they deserve. If a person is bad, that's because they're going to have bad things happen to them. Okay? Going to page 29. Now, remember in terms of compliance. Compliance is getting someone to follow your request. You ask them to come to the movies, you sometimes have to talk them into it. This also is very much what salesmanship is about. Now, you can use 2 routes to get to a person according to the elaboration model. The central route of persuasion, basically you sell somebody a car based on the facts. You give them all the facts about the car, engine, everything else. The peripheral route is you sell the person the car based on feelings, what celebrities do. You basically sell them on everything else except the car. You tell them, you appeal to them, you ask them questions. You know, do they have a family? Oh, your family will love this car. You basically give them peripheral, outside information to try to sell them. Now, remember mere exposure effect. The more they're exposed to something, okay, this is why there's free samples, the more they're going to like the something. Remember cognitive dissonance. When somebody says one thing and does another, which happens, they often feel tension. This is called cognitive dissonance. Okay, their thought process doesn't match. I say I'm a good student, but I cheated on a test. Now, instead of admitting they were wrong, a lot of these people use rationalization to reduce this tension. They may say, well, I just cheated on one test. Other people cheat on every single test. That's rationalization, providing excuses. Now, remember conformity is following what other people are doing. Solomon Asch, he looked at conformity. He went as far as to say, even when the group says, like in his experiment of lines, that the obvious answer is wrong, that other person who was simply being studied would agree with that. All right, would agree with the group, even though they know that answer is wrong. Remember Stanley Milgram with obedience. He took it a step further and would say, would people cause harm to other people if they were told to do so by an authority figure? Okay? Now, the one thing is, Milgram concluded that the only reason that person gave the teacher, who was the person being studied, shocked the learner, and remember the learner was in on the experiment, that was the person that was a Confederate, was simply because they were being told so by the authority figure. Also, they couldn't see the learner. Remember, the teacher was the only one given the shock. Now, in altruism is being a true good person, having complete welfare for other people. Now remember, this was sparked by the Kitty Genovese case. Bibb Latané and John Darley wanted to look at the fact, why didn't anybody help Kitty Genovese? And what they concluded was the bystander effect. Bystander effect says when other people are present, you are less likely to help. Now, why are you less likely to help? Because of something called the diffusion of responsibility. And that means is simply the excuse, well, nobody else was doing anything. You simply say, well, I didn't do anything because he didn't do anything. Okay? And that explains the bystander effect. Now, on the last page, okay, deals with a couple terms that involves the presence of groups. De-individuation is you lose your, so to speak, I want to say common sense, but you lose your identity when other people are around. So what de-individuation is, a decrease in your common sense or identity, and you do a dumb thing just because there's other people watching. Now remember, social facilitation is increased performance or doing better when other people watch you. So in other words, the more people in the facility, the better you do. Social inhibition is actually the opposite. You do worse when other people are watching. Now remember group polarization. Okay? When other people in the group share the same opinion as you do, your opinion, it becomes stronger. So if you say, Mr. So-and-so, was rude today in class, and other people say, yes, he was, that fires you up a little bit. That makes it more and more a believable opinion. Okay, remember scapegoat theory. Scapegoat theory is blaming others for feeling bad, and this is often responsible for why people will blame other people in the class if they do bad because they don't want to feel bad themselves. Now, the last one, superordinate goals. This is an important term, and what this suggests is a person who has a superordinate goal puts their goal aside and looks at the bigger goal. So somebody takes a pay cut because they think of the bigger goal of saving the company. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching.